In this lecture, we will survey the historical and literary context for Sarah Orne Jewett's A White Heron and Suisun Far's Mrs. Spring Fragrance. Jewett witnessed the effects of urbanization and industrialization firsthand. Whereas her family came from a line of seafarers who built their lives on the coast, shipbuilding, sailing, and fishing, the advance of textile mills and canning factories pushed out this old way of life, and many left the small town of South Berwick for the city. She feared that this industrialization shaped not only the health of peoples, but their morality. In a sketch entitled A White Rose Road, she associates the decreasing salmon population in the area with carelessness and caprice, saying, quote, "Years ago, there were so many salmon that, as an enthusiastic old friend once assured me, you could walk across on them below the falls. But now they are unknown, simply because certain substances which would enrich the farms are thrown from factories and tanneries into our clear New England streams. Good river fish are growing very scarce. The supply of one necessary sort of good cheap food is lost to a growing community for the lack of a little thought and care in the factory companies and sawmills and the building in some cases of fishways over the dams. I think that the need of preaching against this bad economy is very great. Everybody patiently accepts the depopulation of a fine, clear river where the tide comes fresh from the sea to be tainted by the spoiled stream, which started from its mountain sources as pure as heart could wish. Man has done his best to ruin the world he lives in, one is tempted to say at impulsive first thought. I believed that with a little more time we should grow wiser about our fish and other things beside." Jewett was participating in a movement towards environmentalism begun by the Romantics of the early 19th century and furthered by transcendentalists like Henry David Thoreau in the mid-19th century and activists like John Muir, who founded the Sierra Club, a seminal environmental organization of the U.S., in the late 19th century. In the quote on the previous slide, we can see that Jewett laments the destruction by industrialism of the relationship between humans and nature. And as we'll see in A White Heron, and like other local colorists, we'll see that elegiac tone manifest in some romanticization of pre-industrialist or agrarian scenes. But what sets Jewett apart is the way she intersects the environment with women's issues. The term ecofeminism was not coined until 1974 when French feminist Françoise Daubon argued that women may have significant insight to the radical envisioning of the ecological movement. However, the ideas behind ecofeminism are presciently available in Jewett's A White Heron. The idea behind ecofeminism is that the problems of environmentalism and women's rights are intrinsically united. The argument has been that environmental issues like deforestation and pollution of water sources impact women, children, and people of color far more than they impact those historically white affluent males driving the industrial practices. Moreover, ecofeminists believe that once there is free practice of gender equality, and note this means not superiority of either women or men, then we'll be on the right track to abandoning the ideologies of dominance that underlie industrialism. So as long as there is any kind of prejudice, men against women, white against black, upper class against lower class, and human against nature, there will be exploitation. Suisun Far is the pen name of Edith Maud Eaton, a Chinese-American writer born in England to a Chinese mother who had been raised in England and a well-to-do white English father whose family cut him off after his marriage. When Far was 7, the family moved to New York, then to Montreal, Canada. By the time she was 11, the family fortune was drained and she and her other siblings were withdrawn from school to help support the family. The father painted, Far crocheted lace, and the younger siblings sold the paintings and lace on the street. When she was 31, she moved to the U.S. and passed her remaining years living and writing in several major cities including Seattle, San Francisco, and Boston, visiting the Chinatown in each when one was available. She adopted her pseudonym Suisun Far, which in Chinese means water lily, and helped support the family with her income as a writer. Far's writing, like others of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, focused on the social, economic, and political imbalance between races and genders. She focused especially on the relationship between Chinese families and European Americans, as well as between Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans, or in other words, internally, within Chinese families who were living in America. 19th century America was xenophobic, that is, highly prejudiced towards Chinese people and fearful of them. Sometimes this fear is called the Yellow Peril, as originally the fear of the Chinese came from the belief that they wielded occult powers. Chinese immigrants began moving to the U.S. in unprecedented numbers in the mid 19th century, some of them curious about America's new frontier and opportunities, including the gold rush, while others were fleeing the Taiping Rebellion or Civil War in China, which took place between the years of 1850 and 1864. Work was also readily available for Chinese immigrants after the Civil War, since the Emancipation Proclamation meant that cheap labor of some kind had to be found to replace the antebellum slave labor force. The Chinese helped to build the first transcontinental railroad, completed in 1869, and many worked in the mines, sending money back to their families in China. Many Chinese lived in Chinatowns, since these were the only places where they could own properties. Thus, Chinatowns became enclaves of Chinese culture, centers for social, religious, and political organizations, businesses, entertainment, and institutions that can still be found today in cities like Seattle and San Francisco. However, with Chinese men pooling into lower class jobs in Chinatowns, a color line became all too evident as a cause and effect of the racial prejudice of European Americans against the Chinese. The prevailing belief in the 19th century was that the Chinese are uncivilized, filthy, and lustful. Chinese women in particular were often believed to be prostitutes. And because the first wave of Chinese immigrants were largely men working to feed their families back home in China, many of the Chinese women in 19th century America were in fact prostitutes. When the postbellum economy began to decline in the 1870s, animosity towards the Chinese became more violent. In 1871, 500 white men entered Chinatown in Los Angeles, California, and lynched 20 Chinese immigrants. This is known as the Chinese Massacre of 1871 and is the largest recorded mass lynching in American history. With the economic depression, animosity towards the Chinese also became more politicized. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act suspended Chinese immigration and denied citizenship to all those already in the country. This act was then renewed in 1892 and was only repealed in 1943, and only then, likely because China and the U.S. had become allies during World War II, which helped to improve the perception of Chinese Americans and the Chinese. Even then, however, naturalized citizenship for Asians was only permitted in 1954, long after African Americans and Native Americans were granted citizenship in 1866 and 1924, respectively. Finally, in 1899, the 2-year-long Boxer Rebellion began, and even though the Boxer Rebellion took place in China, the ramifications were felt worldwide. Over the last century, China had been in constant conflict with colonial powers, including Germany, Russia, the UK, France, and Japan, each of which wanted a piece of China for themselves. In the early 19th century, China fought several wars, losing most of them and giving increasingly greater concessions to these colonial powers. For this reason, the late 19th and early 20th century is known by Chinese nationalists as the century of humiliation. The Boxer Rebellion was the attempt to push out all foreigners, colonial powers, and Christian missionaries, and made those in the U.S. fearful that the Chinese in America may likewise revolt or enact violence upon the European Americans. As a mixed-race woman, Far suffered racism from both American and Chinese peoples, and the identity as one with Chinese heritage is one she had to learn. In her autobiography, Leaves from the Mental Portfolio of an Eurasian, she recounts episode after episode of her childhood, revealing how being Chinese was not something she naturally associated with herself. Not only was she half Chinese, but her mother, while appearing Chinese, behaved and dressed like an English woman, dampening Far's familiarity with Chinese culture. After arriving in America, Far recounts how, in passing a Chinese store, she saw 2 Chinese workers dressed in drab clothing, and she recoiled, shocked by the socioeconomic state and mannerisms of the seemingly heathen and unclean workers, and she asked her brother, "Are we like that?" Then, too, she faced bias as one who is only half Chinese rather than full Chinese or fully European. In her autobiography, she writes, quote, "The question of nationality perplexes my little childhood brain. Why are we what we are, I and my brothers and sisters? Why did God make us to be hooted and stared at? Papa is English, Mama is Chinese. Why couldn't we have been either one thing or the other? Why is my mother's race despised? I look into the faces of my father and mother. Is she not every bit as dear and good as he? Why? Why? I do not confide in my father and mother. They would not understand. How could they? He is English. She is Chinese. I am different to both of them, a stranger, though their own child. Faced thus with bias from all sides, from objectifying stares to vicious slurs, Far became increasingly aware of racism against the Chinese, and as she grew older she learned more about the systematic injustices against Chinese people. Ultimately, she came to feel that the Chinese were her people, that she had an allegiance with them, and as a writer she made it her goal to further cultural awareness and sympathy for Chinese families and Chinese Americans. Her choice to identify as Chinese when her birth name Edith Maud Eaton could easily have passed for white comes most evidentially with her adoption of her pen name Suisun Far, indicating that she is consciously signaling her Chinese roots. That is, the pen name not only means water lily, but symbolizes, as several critics have pointed out, the dignity and indestructible love for family and homeland.